The heavy mahogany doors of Courtroom 6B creaked open as a boy, no older than 17 by the looks of him, stepped inside. The room, packed with attorneys in tailored suits and spectators hunched over legal pads, fell silent for a split second, then filled with hushed whispers and poorly hidden smirks. He wore no suit, no tie. Just dark jeans, a fitted black shirt under a worn hoodie, and sneakers that squeaked faintly against the marble floor. His hair was neatly combed but still gave away that teenage softness, and his expression, calm yet unreadable, didn't help his case in the eyes of the self-important crowd. Judge Horace Whitlock, a man in his late 60s with a booming voice and a thinning wreath of silver hair, adjusted his spectacles and peered over the edge of his bench. He'd been on the bench for 34 years, and in those decades he'd seen arrogance, stupidity, brilliance, and occasionally defiance. But this? A teenager strolling into his court with no legal representative? He found the very sight insulting. The bailiff cleared his throat. Case 4187B. State v. Marcus Doyle. All heads turned to the defendant's table where Marcus Doyle, a stocky man in his 40s with handcuffs digging into his wrists, sat nervously. Sweat slicked his brow. He had been accused of grand larceny and fraud, a case that could put him away for 15 years. He glanced at the door anxiously, expecting his public defender. The teenager walked straight toward him. "What in God's name?" Whitlock muttered, leaning forward. The courtroom doors shut softly behind the young man. He took a seat beside the defendant, setting down a worn leather folder and a small stack of papers. Marcus blinked in disbelief. "You lost, kid?" One of the prosecutors snickered from across the aisle. A few titters echoed among the gallery. The teenager didn't respond. He opened the folder and quietly slid a document across the table to Marcus without meeting his eyes. Judge Whitlock didn't bother hiding his irritation. "Bailiff, is this some kind of joke?" The bailiff shrugged. "He walked in like he belonged here, Your Honor." The judge banged his gavel once, not out of necessity, but out of annoyance. "Young man," he said sternly, "this is a court of law, not a high school hallway. If you are lost or here to observe, take a seat in the back immediately." The boy glanced up for the first time. His eyes were steady, dark, and startlingly composed. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Your Honor." A wave of murmurs rippled through the benches. "You're exactly," the judge scoffed. "Son, unless you're delivering coffee, I suggest you walk right back out the way you came." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Evelyn Graff, leaned back in her chair with folded arms. She wore confidence like a second skin, and the glint in her eye said she enjoyed this kind of humiliation. "Maybe he's here for career day," she said under her breath, and her CO counsel snorted. Marcus Doyle, still shackled, whispered sharply, "You can't be my lawyer. Where's Turner?" They said Turner was assigned. The boy lowered his voice just enough for Marcus to hear, but his words carried an inexplicable calm. "Mr. Turner withdrew this morning. I'm here on your behalf." Marcus froze. "What? This has to be wrong." Judge Whitlock pressed his palms against his temples. "Enough. Bailiff, escort this child out before I hold someone in contempt." But before the bailiff could take a step, the teenager reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I'm filing a notice of appearance as defense counsel for the defendant, Marcus Doyle." The entire courtroom went dead silent. Whitlock's jaw went slack for a moment. Then he burst into laughter, loud, echoing, disbelieving. His gavel struck again. "This is outrageous. Are we filming some reality prank show?" The teenager waited calmly for the noise to die. He held out the document. "You can verify the credentials themselves. Bar number, certification, special authorization, all provided." Graff leaned forward now, frowning. She gestured for the bailiff to take the papers to the judge. The courtroom teetered between confusion and amusement. Whitlock didn't even look at the document at first. "This is absurd. You don't even look old enough to drive." His voice dripped with condescension. "What's your name, boy?" The teenager met his gaze without flinching. "Elias Ward." Someone in the gallery gasped. Another attorney dropped a pen. Judge Whitlock froze for a moment, just a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but then he covered it quickly with sarcasm. "Elias Ward? What, like the prodigy rumor they spread around the conference last year? Don't tell me you're that fairy tale." Elias didn't blink. "I assure you I'm not a myth, Your Honor. And time is limited. My client hasn't been given a proper defense in 3 hearings." The judge's face twitched. Not with fear but with disdain. He finally skimmed the papers, flipping through the bar certification, letters of authorization and federal waivers. His eyes narrowed. Something in the documents made his smirk falter. Behind him, the stenographer raised her eyebrows discreetly. The prosecutor shifted in her seat. The gallery was so quiet the ceiling fans sounded deafening. Senlock let the papers fall to his desk with a soft thud. Assuming, and I mean hypothetically assuming, any of this is legitimate, he said slowly, what kind of illustrious legal training did you undergo? YouTube tutorials? A few laughs followed. Elias remained still. My training came from the Academy of Advanced Jurisprudence, he said evenly. Full scholarship, accelerated program. I completed the bar exam at 15. A man in the back coughed in disbelief. Someone else whispered, the Ward kid, they said he was real? Judge Whitlock leaned back, folding his arms. This is a courtroom, not a talent show. Even if by some miracle those credentials check out, you are a child, a novelty act. Elias finally turned toward the prosecutor's table. Miss Graff, I'll need all discovery files, including the withheld affidavits and the unsubmitted surveillance record dated 3 months prior. I know you have them. We can do this formally, or through a motion to compel. Graff's confident posture stiffened. She exchanged a look with her CO counsel. Judge Whitlock pounded the gavel again, this time less amused and more unsettled. You are not in charge here, he snapped. Until I verify this circus of paperwork, you are nothing more than a disruption. Elias sat back, folding his hands. Then verify it. Now. I'll wait. The gallery held its breath. The judge signaled his clerk to step forward and begin checking the credentials with the State Bar database. As the clerk hurried out of the courtroom, Judge Whitlock glared at the teenager with thinly veiled contempt. I don't know who you think you are, boy, but I promise you, if this is a stunt, you'll regret ever stepping foot in my courtroom. Elias did not respond. He simply looked ahead, his calmness not the arrogance of youth, but the cold certainty of someone who knew exactly why he was there. The air had shifted, the laughter had faded, and for the first time since he entered, no one was mocking him. They were waiting, uneasily, for what would come next. The courtroom buzzed in a tense quiet as the clerk rushed out with Elias's credentials. But while the present held its breath, the past, the one no one in that room knew, slowly stirred beneath the surface. Elias Ward didn't come from privilege, legacy or polished legal dynasty. He came from silence, sacrifice, and a boyhood torn between loss and intellect. He was 9 the first time he stepped inside a courtroom, not as a spectator, but as a child whose life was unraveling. His father, Daniel Ward, had once been a respected mechanic who ran a small auto shop on the outskirts of Brookdale, humble, hard-working, loved by his community. Elias and his older sister, June, grew up in the small apartment above the garage, the smell of engine oil and metal shavings embedded in their clothes. Then came the faulty part. A defect in a luxury vehicle his shop had serviced. The car malfunctioned, an accident followed, and a lawsuit spiraled. The corporation that manufactured the defective part had power, connections, and lawyers who lined up like wolves in designer suits. Daniel, with his limited resources, was blamed. The media twisted the story. The court believed the wrong side. He couldn't afford proper counsel. He trusted a public attorney who barely reviewed the case file. When the verdict was delivered, it didn't just bankrupt him, it broke him. Elias had sat there during the proceedings, legs dangling from the wooden bench, listening to legal jargon most children would ignore. But he didn't ignore it, he absorbed it. Words like liability, discovery, and burden of proof didn't scare him, they angered him. The injustice carved something cold and sharp into his mind. Not long after the judgment, Daniel suffered a stroke brought on by stress and financial ruin. He survived, but barely. His mobility was compromised, and with mounting medical debt, the family lost their shop, their home, their sense of safety. June quit college to work nights in a warehouse. Elias buried himself in textbooks, online lectures, and printed case law he borrowed from a used bookstore. At 10, he was studying college-level logic. At 12, he was writing amicus briefs, for practice. At 13, he was offering advice to adults in online legal forums under anonymous aliases, some of which lawyers privately admitted rivaled their own strategies. His family noticed a change in him, not in affection, he loved them deeply, but in warmth. His mother, who passed when he was young, had been the soft force in his life. Without her, and with his father's health declining, life hardened quickly. Emotion became secondary to survival. While other kids played soccer and posted selfies, he was decoding appellate court rulings and studying cross-examination techniques. People who glimpsed his intellect called it genius. Elias never embraced the word. For him, it was necessity. At 14 he petitioned for early admission into an advanced jurisprudence academy known to accept savants and unconventional prodigies. His application was a curiosity until they read his entrance thesis dissecting a landmark Supreme Court decision and proposing a more equitable interpretation of liability law. He was accepted, not without controversy. The academy was rigorous, competitive, filled with students years older than him. Some mocked his age, some tested him, but professors began to whisper that he wasn't simply ahead, he was rewriting frameworks. He completed his coursework with acceleration waivers, passed the bar at 15 through a state-sanctioned pilot route, and began selective legal consulting under sealed authorization. Quietly, carefully. Because the state had not anticipated the press consequence of a teenage legal mind practicing before he could legally vote. But brilliance has a cost. Childhood friendships faded. Invitations to socialize were ignored. Emotionally, Elias became composed to the point of ice. He wasn't cruel, he was distant. Not detached from morality, but from vulnerability. And yet, he had one rule: he would defend those failed by the system, those with no money, no voice, no chance. He took small cases, ghost-wrote legal strategies for overworked public defenders, and slipped into courtrooms unnoticed. He'd seen what happened to his father when no one fought back. Marcus Doyle was not his first client. But he might become his most public. Back in courtroom 6B, Marcus sat hunched at the defense table, still trying to piece together why a teenager had appeared in his place. Fear clouded his features, the kind of fear that comes not just from prosecution, but from abandonment. He'd been promised representation twice, and twice his lawyers backed out when the case looked bleak. Elias, still seated, didn't look at Marcus, but his voice softened just a shade when he finally spoke. "They used your prior debt record to bias the bail review," he murmured. "Your last attorney didn't challenge the unverified testimony from the warehouse accountant. That's why the prosecution thinks they can bury you." Marcus blinked, stunned. How do you know that? I never even saw that file." "You weren't supposed to," Elias replied. "They don't expect defendants like you to understand what was left out." There was no arrogance in his tone, just clarity. Marcus studied him, confusion mingling with a curious flicker of hope. "Why are you helping me? You're a kid. You don't even know me." Elias's fingers drummed the table quietly. His gaze remained forward. "I don't need to know you to know the system failed you before you walked in." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Then his eyes watered, barely, but enough. It wasn't gratitude that moved him first. It was disbelief that someone, anyone, cared. Across the aisle, Evelyn Graff pretended not to watch the interaction, but she did. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She wasn't known for mercy, she was known for efficiency and conviction rates. And the attorney, had just called out her discovery practices in front of the entire court. Judge Whitlock shifted behind the bench, irritation coiling with unease. His disdain for Elias wasn't only about the boy's age. It was about what Elias represented, an uninvited disruption to the hierarchy he'd spent his life navigating. A courtroom is a stage of power, and Whitlock was used to controlling the script. He told himself the credentials, once exposed as fraudulent, would justify an immediate removal. Yet, a part of him, the part forged from decades of legal memory, recognized the name: Elias Ward. He'd dismissed the rumors years ago, chalking them up to journalistic sensationalism and academic myth. Now the name had entered his court in sneakers. As the tension simmered, the door opened and the clerk re-entered, breathless and pale. She handed a printout to the judge. He read it once, then again, slower. No one could read the paper from where they sat, but they could see the judge's expression shift, not to friendliness but to something far rarer for him, awareness. He set the sheet down carefully. "Mr. Elias Ward," he said slowly, the mocking edge notably absent for the first time. "Until further notice, this court will recess for verification of your appointment. Do not leave." Elias gave a single nod. As the gavel struck once more, Marcus leaned in, whispering, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Elias didn't look at him, but his answer held the quiet conviction born from years of silent war. "I've known since I was 9. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited for nothing, Not yet. No cameras had turned, no headlines were brewing, but the air had already shifted, and the walls of the system he'd studied his entire life were about to feel the tremor of a storm that didn't roar. It calculated. And for the first time in a long while, the cold in Elias's chest started to thaw, not from warmth, but from purpose sharpening into something undeniable. Courtroom 6B reconvened after a brief recess, but everything felt different. The whispers had sharpened into murmurs of disbelief. Reporters still hadn't arrived. This was supposed to be an ordinary hearing, but the scent of a storm was quietly threading its way through the air. Judge Whitlock returned to the bench with a stiffness that betrayed his unease. His eyes flicked toward Elias only once, then shifted immediately to the prosecution table. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and announced, "Credentials have been tentatively recognized. Pending full confirmation from the State Bar, Mr. Elias Ward will be provisionally acknowledged as counsel of record." A stunned silence followed. Even the bailiff, a seasoned man with a poker face carved from years of routine, glanced at Elias as if seeing him differently. Evelyn Graff, the prosecutor, stood slowly. Her composure didn't crack, but it tightened. "Your Honor, the state has serious reservations about allowing an unorthodox and unprecedented legal participant to take over an active criminal case without oversight." Whitlock nodded once. "Your concern is noted." He turned to Elias. "Mr. Ward, you will conduct yourself with decorum. Should there be any misconduct, this court will remove you immediately. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elias replied calmly. Graff wasn't done. Additionally, the state requests a competency review before allowing him to continue in any capacity. A ripple of annoyance moved through the gallery, not in defense of Elias, but at the scent of conflict. Elias rose smoothly. "A competency review is unnecessary. My bar certification has already passed federal and state assessment. Your concern would be better addressed by adhering to the rules of discovery you've already violated." Graff's lips twitched, a crack in her poise. Allegations like that should not be thrown around lightly. That's bold language for someone whose voice still needs to deepen. Several people stifled awkward laughter. Marcus flinched slightly, not because of the insult, but because he feared the young attorney might provoke the court too far. He leaned over and whispered, "Maybe take it easy, kid. They're already looking for a reason to throw you out." Elias didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the judge. "I'll file a motion to compel production of all withheld documents. If the prosecution has nothing to hide, they should have no reason to object." Graff stepped forward. "Your Honor." Whitlock raised a hand, forcing silence. He looked between them both before speaking slowly. "Miss Graff, the defense is entitled to all discoverable materials. If anything has been omitted, I expect immediate compliance." The prosecutor stiffened, then forced a placid smile. "The state will review its files and ensure everything relevant is present." Elias sat, but tension still hovered around him like static. Across the room a young clerk returned with a sealed envelope and approached the bench. Whitlock opened it, scanned the contents, and his expression darkened. His eyes drifted back to Elias with something colder than annoyance, reluctant acknowledgement. He set the letter aside. Proceeding. But the conflict was far from over. Graff pivoted strategy. "Your Honor, before we continue, the state moves to revoke pretrial motions previously submitted by the defense, on grounds that the former attorney of record is no longer present to argue them." Marcus's jaw dropped. "What? She can't just," Elias answered before the judge could speak. "I will be assuming those motions. And I'll be expanding them." Whitlock eyed him carefully. "On what basis?" "The basis," Elias replied, "that previous counsel failed to challenge illegally obtained financial records that are central to the state's argument. Those submissions were entered without proper chain of custody." Graff's eyes flashed. "That is a baseless accusation." "It's not," Elias said calmly. "The warehouse footage wasn't authenticated, the accountant's statement was taken without legal advisement present, and the supposed ledger that ties Mr. Doyle to the theft is missing the original timestamps. You're building a case on a narrative, not evidence." A low murmur grew in the gallery. Graff inhaled sharply, but recovered with a slim smile. "So you've reviewed a case file you weren't officially assigned to until, 20 minutes ago?" "I reviewed it 2 days ago," Elias said simply. "I anticipated Mr. Turner would withdraw." The judge's eyes narrowed. And how would you know that? Elias met his gaze with unsettling calm. Because the prosecution pressured him off the case. The room erupted. Not loud but sharp. A few gasps, scattered whispers. Someone muttered, "He said that out loud." Graff slammed her hand on the table. "That is an outrageous lie." "Check the phone records," Elias said, tone unshaken. "Mr. Turner received a call from your office the same afternoon he requested removal. He also received notice from a private firm offering him a position if he detached himself from the case." Whitlock's face paled with disbelief. "And something else, fear of what this might expose." Graff's voice flattened. "Your Honor, this child is inventing fantasy conspiracies in an attempt to derail due process." "If it's fantasy," Elias said quietly, "I invite a subpoena." The silence that followed had weight, and it was Graff, not Whitlock, who broke first. "The state will not dignify this with further comment." Whitlock ran a hand over his face. "Enough. We will proceed with the original schedule. Mr. Ward will have the opportunity to file new motions by end of week. Ms. Graff will comply with discovery." He banged his gavel softly, not forcefully, almost tiredly. Marcus finally turned toward Elias with an incredulous look. "You're out of your mind, you know that?" Elias didn't look at him, but his voice softened again by a fraction. "I don't fight fair when the system doesn't." Whitlock called for a short adjournment while the prosecution organized their materials. As people stood and stretched, the room filled with cautious chatter. The gallery no longer saw a joke at the defense table. They saw a disruption they couldn't categorize. But conflict wasn't limited to the courtroom. As Elias stepped into the hallway with Marcus and the bailiff escorting him, a man in a charcoal suit approached, sleek, polished, predatory. Richard Kelman, a senior partner at a high-tier law firm known for selling victory to the highest bidder. He smiled thinly. "Mr. Ward." Elias paused but didn't turn fully. "I'm not interested." Kelman adjusted his cufflinks. "You don't even know what I'm offering." "Yes, I do," Elias said. "I've read your firm's contract policies. I don't sell defense strategies to corporations that bury whistleblowers." Marcus stared at the exchange, confused. The bailiff blinked. Kelman's smile didn't fade. "You're wasting your talent playing hero to broke defendants. Think carefully. There are people who won't like what you're doing in there." Elias finally met his gaze. "They didn't like it when I was 10 either." Kelman's expression flickered, then he stepped aside. "Consider this your last courtesy warning." Marcus looked between them. "Who was that?" "No one," Elias said, continuing down the hall, but his posture, straight as steel, betrayed a flicker of something beneath, memory or old resentment. Back inside, tensions multiplied. Prosecutors whispered strategy. Whitlock conferred quietly with his clerk, perhaps wondering if this case would leave a stain on his record or become a headline. The gallery watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. Marcus finally spoke what everyone was thinking. "They're gonna come for you." Elias finally glanced at him, not with fear, not even with anger, but with clarity. They always do, when truth doesn't ask permission, and deep inside, behind the sharpened conviction, something old stirred, an ache that had never healed, a fire born in a courtroom years ago when no one believed him because he was just a child. They believed him now, and that was going to cost someone. When the court reconvened after lunch, the mood had shifted again, no longer curiosity, but expectancy. The gallery was fuller. Word had spread through the courthouse that something unusual, maybe historic, was unfolding. Marcus sat beside Elias in tense silence, his leg bouncing beneath the table. Every so often he glanced at the young attorney as if trying to decide whether to believe or brace for disaster. Judge Whitlock entered, gavel striking once. "We will resume proceedings for Case 4187B. Mr. Ward, the court acknowledges your provisional standing. You may proceed." Elias stood, his posture calm but unyielding. "Your Honor, the defense submits a motion to dismiss based on prosecutorial misconduct and compromised evidence." Graff shot up instantly. "Absolutely not. The state rejects this," Elias continued without raising his voice. "The ledger tying my client to the alleged theft is falsified. The timestamps do not match the warehouse's electronic records, and the original copy was replaced with a selectively edited version. Additionally, the state withheld the surveillance footage that would have placed Mr. Doyle outside the premises during the incident." Graff stiffened. "We withheld nothing. Those claims are speculative." Elias turned his gaze to the clerk's station. "Your Honor, I filed a subpoena request for the unedited footage, The original report was logged by Officer Harold Nunes, but the file was never submitted. The time-stamped camera footage has metadata showing alteration on the day the case was filed. Whitlock frowned, glancing down at the paperwork he'd only half-skimmed earlier. And how did you obtain this information? By reviewing the partial discovery and cross-referencing with the warehouse's public maintenance logs, Elias said simply. The logs are dated and accessible. The prosecution hoped no one would check. Graff slammed her hand on the table. This is character assassination. No, Elias replied, still calm. It's proof that someone wanted a conviction more than the truth. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom like distant thunder. Whitlock held up a hand. Miss Graff, do you deny the existence of unsubmitted footage? Graff's expression hardened. There are multiple camera angles. Not all were considered relevant. That's not your decision, Elias said, and the angle removed was the one showing a different figure, someone matching the height and build of Christopher Van, the state's key witness. The name struck like a nerve. Even Whitlock's fingers paused mid-tap. Graff recovered quickly. Your Honor, this is tactical showmanship. Van is a protected witness. He's a felon with 2 prior convictions. Elias countered, finally turning his full gaze on her, and he accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Marcus Doyle. A stunned murmur erupted. Marcus stared, wide-eyed. Whitlock leaned forward. Is this accurate? Graff hesitated for the first time. The witness's record is sealed, not sealed to defense counsel with proper clearance, Elias said. He reached into his folder and handed a document to the bailiff. This is the plea agreement Van signed 3 weeks before testifying. The prosecution withheld this from discovery. The judge's brows furrowed as he read the file. A heavy stillness followed. Elias continued, voice low but piercing. Christopher Van wasn't an observer. He was involved. The missing footage shows him entering the restricted storage area. My client wasn't even on site. He clocked out 30 minutes earlier. That record was suppressed too. Marcus blinked rapidly, as if afraid to hope. Whitlock looked to Graff, but this time his tone carried warning. Miss Graff, explain this. Graff's jaw clenched. Your Honor, the state believed the footage was irrelevant to the charges. No, Elias said, the first edge of steel entering his tone. You believed it was inconvenient. Whitlock exhaled slowly. It was the sound of a man realizing this case had just become something else entirely. I want that footage brought to this court by tomorrow morning, he ordered, his voice cold. And I want the chain of evidence reviewed immediately. Elias shook his head. That won't be necessary. He turned slightly as someone entered the courtroom from the side door, Officer Harold Nunes holding a drive. The gallery collectively stirred. I contacted Officer Nunes directly during recess, Elias said. He confirmed the footage was removed and provided a copy under oath. The defense submits it as Exhibit F. Graff shot up. Objection, this is an ambush. No, Elias said, this is what happens when the truth is buried and someone digs. The bailiff handed the drive to the clerk, who played the footage on the courtroom monitor. Silence blanketed the room, as the video displayed the warehouse entrance. A figure, stocky, hooded, unmistakably not Marcus, approached the storage area. Moments later he exited carrying a duffel bag. The timestamp landed exactly during the time Marcus was recorded, clocking out from his job at a nearby auto shop. Marcus buried his face in his hands. He didn't weep, but his shoulders shook once, silently. Whitlock stared at the screen, then at Graff, then at Elias. The weight of years of courtroom certainty seemed to tremble inside him. This changes everything, the judge said quietly. Elias spoke again, not triumphantly, but with clarity that filled the space. The system failed my client before this trial even began. The evidence was distorted. His representation was sabotaged. His name was targeted because it was easier than seeking the real culprit. Graff sat, stunned. The confidence she wore like armor had cracked. Marcus finally looked up, voice barely audible. You saved my life, kid. Elias didn't respond at first. For a flicker of a moment, something soft crossed his expression, but only briefly. Whitlock cleared his throat. Pending further review, this court suspends all charges against Marcus Doyle. He is to be released immediately from custody. Additionally, the court will initiate an inquiry into prosecutorial conduct and mishandled evidence. A wave of whispers and astonished gasps swept the gallery. Marcus exhaled a broken, disbelieving laugh, rubbing his eyes as if afraid to wake up from a dream. But Whitlock wasn't done. He turned to Elias. Mr. Ward. Elias met his gaze. The judge's next words came slowly, weighted with reluctant respect. "You have upended my expectations today. You challenged this courtroom with evidence, not theatrics, and whether or not I agree with the unconventional nature of your presence here, I cannot deny the impact of your work." For the first time, Whitlock didn't sound dismissive, just humbled. Elias inclined his head slightly. "Justice isn't conventional, Your Honor. It's necessary." A hush held the room. And though no one cheered, no one clapped. Something deeper happened, they believed. Not in his age, not in the spectacle, but in the truth he'd forced into the light. Marcus touched his arm. "Thank you," he whispered, voice thick. Elias nodded once. No smile, no celebration. Just a quiet understanding that this wasn't victory. It was repair. And repair was only the beginning. The courthouse steps were usually a place people hurried down, eager to escape the chill of legal scrutiny. But that afternoon, as the double doors opened and Marcus walked out a free man, the breeze felt different, lighter, almost forgiving. Marcus paused just outside, as though expecting someone to snatch the moment away. His mother, who hadn't been able to speak through most of the trial, stood trembling beside him, hands pressed to her mouth. When he finally turned toward her, she collapsed into his arms, tears leaving dark tracks across her cheeks. The world around them blurred for a moment, and no camera, officer or reporter dared intrude. Elias stepped through the doorway moments after, not walking with celebration but with purpose, as though his mind was already 3 steps ahead. The crowd, spectators, court staff, strangers who had slipped into the gallery after whispers of the trial spread, watched him with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for unsolved riddles. Some took pictures, others simply stared. Marcus pulled away from his mother and approached Elias. The older man's voice was still hoarse from the strain of emotion and fear. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus said. "You did more than any lawyer twice your age would have done." Elias gave a small nod. "You didn't deserve what happened to you, that was enough reason." Marcus blinked, searching his face for some expression beyond neutrality. "You saved my life," he repeated, quieter this time, like a truth he still couldn't say without disbelief. Elias's gaze drifted to the courthouse behind them. "Someone once saved mine. I guess I'm just repaying the debt." Marcus frowned. Curiosity sparked. But something in Elias's tone said that was all he would reveal. A few reporters tried to approach, but a firm gesture from Officer Nunez, who had quietly followed them out, held them at bay. The officer glanced at Elias with something like respect. "I didn't think anyone would go that far to pull files like that," he said. "Most wouldn't risk the blowback." Elias turned to him. "Most don't know what it's like to be dismissed before they speak." Nunez nodded once, the way men do when they've just recognized a truth they once ignored. Across the plaza, Judge Whitlock stood behind a stone column, partially in shadow. He wasn't hiding, only thinking, watching the young man he had mocked, doubted, and nearly disregarded entirely. For the first time in his long career, he wondered how many minds he'd closed before a word was spoken, how many truths he'd smothered in the name of decorum and assumption. He wished, briefly, that he could speak to Elias, but the weight of his robe and his pride held him in place. Inside his mind, a shift had begun. Hours later, the courthouse emptied fully. Marcus had gone home with his mother. Officer Nunez filed a report that would trigger more investigations than Graff likely imagined, and the woman who'd carried herself with such prosecutorial certainty left the building in silence, her expression pale and unreadable. Elias didn't go home because home had never been a place. It was motion, thought, and persistence. Instead, he found a quiet bench adjacent to the courthouse garden. The late afternoon sky had begun to melt into amber, shadows stretching across the pavement. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, worn from age. On it was a headline from years earlier: "Teen wrongfully convicted in botched case." A dark-haired child in handcuffs stared blankly at the camera, pain buried under shock. It had been his brother. They hadn't saved him in time. Elias had been too young to understand laws then, but not too young to understand silence, how it strangles. When his brother died in custody, alone, unheard, something inside Elias changed with a finality that left no room for childhood. He had vowed no one would be buried by the system without a voice, not while he still breathed. That vow had led him here. Footsteps approached. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Judge Whitlock stood a few feet away, hesitating like a man approaching a confession booth. The lines on his face seemed deeper today. "I owe you words I rarely give," the judge said finally. Elias remained silent, letting him continue. Whitlock exhaled. I was wrong about you. Not just your credentials, your purpose. You forced this court to see what it refused to see. And you reminded me what justice is supposed to look like. Elias folded the clipping and slipped it back into his coat. Justice isn't polite, Your Honor. It's persistent. The judge's lips twitched, not quite a smile but something softened. If you ever decide to practice law under conventional circumstances, you'll have a future brighter than you know. Elias met his eyes, and for the first time, Whitlock saw not a prodigy to be puzzled over, but a storm contained in flesh. I don't think convention was made for me, Elias said. Whitlock nodded. Maybe not, but the law needs people who make it uncomfortable. He left without another word, and Elias watched the sky until the first streetlight kindled above him. The evening had grown cold, but he didn't feel it. A week later, Marcus returned to the courthouse, not in cuffs, but with paperwork for expungement and a chance at work he'd thought forever gone. He passed by a receptionist, who whispered, "Is that the guy from the case?" But her tone held respect, not suspicion. Outside, two young men debated heatedly on a bench. "I'm telling you, he was like 16, one said. "No way. You can't even get a license by then. Maybe he was a prodigy or something crazy." Marcus paused. "If you see him, tell him thanks again." They looked up. "You know him?" Marcus gave a quiet smile. "Nobody really knows him, but some of us owe him everything." He walked away lighter than he'd ever been. Elias left town 2 days after the case closed. No fanfare, no articles, no interviews. Just a weathered suitcase, a file of pending injustices, and the same steady stride that unnerved every doubter. People would talk for years about the boy who defied a courtroom and exposed a lie. Some would call it legend, others would dismiss it as rumor. But there were those who sat in the gallery that day, who saw with their own eyes a system bent at the knee to a voice it tried to ignore. And they would remember. Not the spectacle, not the scandal. They would remember the moment a young man reminded them that truth doesn't need permission to speak, only the courage to be heard. And somewhere in another city, in another courthouse with another name on the docket, a quiet storm would arrive again. Unannounced, uninvited, and utterly unstoppable. Because for Elias Ward, justice wasn't a profession, it was a promise.